I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. At my son's wedding, my daughter-in-law smashed my face into the hot mashed potatoes. "Taste the food, old witch," she whispered so only I could hear. That's when someone among the guests turned pale with terror and screamed. "She's a billionaire." That night, I did something that changed everything. I should have known something was wrong the moment I walked into that reception hall. The way conversations stopped mid-sentence, how heads turned and whispers followed me like shadows. But I was so focused on my son Mason, so desperate to make this day perfect despite everything, that I ignored every warning sign. The wedding had been beautiful. Mason looked handsome in his black tuxedo, standing at the altar with tears in his eyes as Grace walked down the aisle in her flowing white dress. For a moment, watching them exchange vows, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, hope. Maybe this marriage would heal the distance between my son and me. Maybe Grace would be the bridge I'd been searching for. I was so wrong. The reception was held at the Grand Ballroom downtown, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over round tables draped in ivory linens. I'd offered to help pay for the venue, but Grace had insisted they handle everything themselves. "We want to do this our way, Mrs. Barrett," she'd said with that sweet smile that never quite reached her eyes. I found my assigned seat at table 12 near the back, not at the family table where Mason's new in-laws sat laughing and toasting, not even close to the head table where the bride and groom would sit. Table 12 with distant cousins I barely knew, and family friends who seemed uncomfortable making conversation with me. The evening dragged on with speeches and dancing. I watched Mason spin Grace across the dance floor, her laughter ringing out above the music. He looked so happy, so completely absorbed in his new wife. When was the last time he'd looked at me like that? When was the last time he'd looked at me at all with anything other than polite tolerance? Dinner was served around 800, prime rib, roasted vegetables, and garlic mashed potatoes. I picked at my food, my appetite gone. The woman next to me, Mason's great-aunt Margaret, kept shooting me sympathetic glances. "You must be so proud," she whispered, leaning close enough that I could smell her floral perfume. "I am," I replied, forcing a smile. "Mason deserves happiness." That's when I noticed Grace making her way toward our table. She moved with purpose, her jaw set in a way that made my stomach clench. Mason was nowhere to be seen, probably in the bathroom or getting some air. "Mrs. Barrett," Grace said when she reached my chair. Her voice was loud enough to carry to nearby tables. "I wanted to personally thank you for everything you've done for Mason." Something in her tone made me tense. "Of course, dear. He's my son." "Yes, he is." Her smile was sharp now, predatory. "And you've been such a dedicated mother, working all those night shifts, missing his school plays, his baseball games, always so busy." The conversations around us had stopped completely. I could feel eyes on us, the weight of sudden attention. "Grace, perhaps we could talk about this later," I suggested quietly. "Oh, no. I think now is perfect." She moved closer, and I caught a whiff of alcohol on her breath. "You see, Mason told me all about his childhood, how you were never there, how he spent most nights alone while you were off doing whatever it was you did." My cheeks burned. "I was working to support us after his father died. After his father died, you abandoned him." Her voice rose another notch. "You chose work over your own child. And now you want to play grandmother to our future children." The words hit me like physical blows. Around us, the silence was deafening. I could see people pulling out their phones, recording this public humiliation. "Grace, please, please what?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Please pretend you were a good mother. Please act like Mason doesn't still wake up sometimes calling for a mommy who was never there." I tried to stand, to escape this nightmare, but Grace placed a firm hand on my shoulder, pushing me back down. That's when I saw the plate of mashed potatoes in her other hand. "You know what, Mrs. Barrett, since you're so interested in family dinners now, why don't you really taste the food?" Before I could react, before anyone could stop her. Grace shoved the plate toward my face. The hot mashed potatoes hit me square in the cheek and mouth, burning my skin. The force knocked me sideways in my chair, and I felt the scalding mixture slide down my neck and onto my dress. "Taste the food, you old witch," she whispered harshly, her mask of civility completely gone. "Taste what a real family meal feels like." The pain was immediate and intense, not just from the heat of the potatoes, but from the complete shock of what had just happened. I sat there stunned, food dripping from my face and hair, unable to process that this was really happening. The ballroom erupted, people gasped. Chairs scraped against the floor as guests stood to get a better view. Someone was shouting for napkins. Another person was calling for hotel security. But through it all, I heard one voice above the chaos, a man I didn't recognize, standing near the bar with his mouth hanging open. "Oh my God," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "Do you people have any idea who you just attacked? That's Fiona Barrett. She's worth over $3 billion. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the room turned to me, sitting there covered in mashed potatoes, my carefully styled hair ruined, my dignity shattered. $3 billion. The number hung in the air like an accusation. Grace's face went white. Her hand, still holding the empty plate, began to tremble. Around us, I could see the gears turning in people's minds, recalculating everything they thought they knew about the modest woman in the simple blue dress. I finally managed to stand, potato mixture still sliding down my face. Without a word, I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking against the marble floor in the absolute silence. No one tried to stop me. No one said a word. But as I reached the door, I heard Mason's voice behind me, confused and desperate. Mom, wait, what's he talking about? What, $3 billion? I didn't turn around. I couldn't bear to see the look in my son's eyes, the questions, the accusations, the realization that his mother had been lying to him his entire life. That night, sitting in my small apartment washing mashed potatoes out of my hair, I made a decision that would change everything. They wanted to know about the $3 billion. They were about to find out exactly what Fiona Barrett was capable of when pushed too far. 3 days passed before Mason called. 3 days of sitting in my small apartment, staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring. When it finally did, his voice was different, colder, more distant than I'd ever heard it. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. No greeting, no asking how I was after what happened at his wedding. "Raya wants to apologize." Of course she did. Now that she knew who I really was, suddenly she wanted to apologize. "I'll come to your place," I said quietly. "No," his response was quick, sharp. "Neutral ground. That cafe on 5th Street. 1 hour. The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there holding the phone, feeling the familiar ache in my chest that had become my constant companion over the years. This was how Mason talked to business associates, not his mother. But then again, Mason had never really known his mother. Not the real one. I arrived at the cafe early, choosing a corner table where we could have privacy. The autumn rain drummed against the windows, matching my mood perfectly. When Mason walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. The joy from his wedding day was gone, replaced by something harder, more suspicious. Grace wasn't with him. "Where's your wife?" I asked as he sat down across from me. "She's processing everything." He ordered coffee from the waitress, then fixed me with a stare I'd never seen before. "Is it true? Mom, are you really worth billions?" The question hung between us like a landmine. I'd practiced this conversation in my head dozens of times over the years, but now that it was happening, I felt unprepared. "Yes," I said simply. Mason's jaw tightened. "How? Where to begin? How do you explain 30 years of careful planning, of sacrifices your child never knew you made, of a life lived in shadows to protect the one person who mattered most? It started after your father died," I began, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Do you remember those months right after the funeral, how I was working all the time? I remember being alone," he said, and the bitterness in his voice cut deep. "You were 6 years old. Your father left us with nothing but debt and an insurance policy that barely covered the funeral expenses. I had a choice: find a way to survive or watch us lose everything. I took a sip of my coffee, buying time, remembering those dark early days. I started cleaning office buildings at night. That's where I met Eleanor Blackwood. She owned a small real estate company that was struggling. She used to work late, and we'd talk while I cleaned her office. Mason was listening now, his expression unreadable. Eleanor saw something in me. She taught me about real estate, about investment opportunities. When she retired 5 years later, she sold me her company for almost nothing, said I reminded her of her daughter. That was only part of the truth. Of course, Eleanor had seen more than potential in me. She'd seen desperation, intelligence, and a work ethic that bordered on obsession. She'd also seen a woman who would do anything to secure her child's future. I was good at it, Mason, better than good. I could spot undervalued properties, negotiate deals that others couldn't see. Within 10 years, I'd expanded from commercial real estate to residential developments, then to international investments. So, you just forgot to mention this. His voice was rising now, drawing glances from other customers. You let me think we were poor. You let me go to college on scholarships when you could have paid for Harvard. This was the heart of it, the wound that had been festering for decades. I wanted you to have your own life, I said, leaning forward. Free from gold diggers, from people who would only see you as a meal ticket. I wanted you to find love that was real, not someone attracted to your money. Mason laughed, but there was no humor in it. Like Grace, the irony wasn't lost on either of us. In trying to protect him from fortune hunters, I'd made him vulnerable to a different kind of predator. You have no idea what growing up rich does to a child, I continued. I've seen it destroy families, turn children into entitled monsters who never learn the value of work or genuine relationships. So instead you made me feel worthless, he said quietly. Do you know what it was like? Mom watching other kids get picked up by their parents while you were always working, missing every school play, every parent-teacher conference. I thought you didn't care. My heart broke a little more with each word. I cared. I cared so much that I worked myself to exhaustion to build something for you. Every late night, every missed dinner, every time I chose work over being with you, it was all for you. No. Mason shook his head. It was for your guilt, your need to prove something. You could have found a balance, but you chose the money. He was wrong. But I couldn't tell him the whole truth. Not yet. He didn't know about the lawyers I'd hired to protect us from his father's family, who'd tried to claim he wasn't really their son. He didn't know about the private security I'd paid for during those early years when his father's business associates came looking for money they claimed he owed. He didn't know about the trust fund I'd set up that would make him independently wealthy on his 40th birthday, regardless of what happened to my estate. I know you're angry, I said instead, and you have every right to be. I made mistakes, Mason, but everything I did was to protect you. Protect me from what having a mother who was present. The words stung because they held truth. I had been absent physically and emotionally. The empire I'd built had consumed me, driven by a terror that if I ever slowed down, if I ever let my guard down, something terrible would happen to the only family I had left. From people like Grace, I said quietly. Mason's face flushed red. Don't you dare. Grace loves me. Grace attacked me at your wedding reception, I reminded him. In front of 200 people, she humiliated me publicly. Is that what love looks like to you? She was protecting me from someone she thought was a selfish, absent mother. He paused. And maybe she was right. The words hit their mark. I sat back in my chair, feeling suddenly very old and very tired. Maybe she was, I agreed. But that doesn't change what she did or what she's planning to do now that she knows about the money. Mason's expression flickered just for a moment with something that might have been doubt, but then his jaw set again, and I knew I'd lost this round. I need time to process this, he said, standing up. All of it. Mason, wait, no, Mom. For 30 years, you've been lying to me. For 30 years. You've let me believe we struggled when you were sitting on billions. I need to figure out what else you've been hiding." He walked away without looking back, leaving me alone at the table with my cold coffee and the weight of 3 decades of secrets. Outside, the rain had turned to sleet, and I watched the ice form on the windows while my mind raced. Mason was angry, confused, and hurt. I understood that. But Grace was something else entirely. The way she'd looked at me before that attack, the calculated cruelty of her words, the public nature of the humiliation, none of that was spontaneous. She'd planned it, which meant she'd known about my money before that guest blurted it out. The question was, how long had she known, and more importantly, what was she planning to do with that knowledge now? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Marcus Reynolds had been my head of security for 15 years, a former FBI agent who specialized in protecting high-net-worth individuals from threats, both external and internal. "Marcus," I said when he answered, "I need you to run a complete background check on someone, and I need it done quietly." Because if Grace thought she could humiliate me and then waltz back into my life now that she knew I was wealthy, she was about to learn exactly what Fiona Barrett did to people who threatened her family. Marcus Reynolds' report arrived on my desk exactly 72 hours after I'd requested it. 3 manila folders, each one thicker than I'd expected. As I opened the first one, my coffee grew cold while I read about the woman my son had married. Grace Elizabeth Collins, born in Cleveland, Ohio, 28 years old, dropped out of college 3 times. Previously named Grace Miller before a legal name change at 22. No steady employment history in the past 5 years. What she did have was a pattern. The photographs were what stopped me cold. Marcus had managed to obtain pictures from social media accounts Grace had deleted, but nothing truly disappears from the internet when you know where to look. There she was at charity galas in Miami, always on the arm of different men. Designer dresses, expensive jewelry, first-class vacation photos, all with men who were significantly older and, according to Marcus's notes, significantly wealthier than their ages might suggest. David Harrison, age 42, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, dated Grace for 8 months before she disappeared with $20,000 from his personal checking account. No charges were filed. Michael Cortez, age 39, owner of 3 successful restaurants in Chicago. Their engagement lasted 6 months before he discovered she'd been using his credit cards to finance a lifestyle he'd never authorized. Again, no legal action taken. Jonathan Parker, age 35, tech entrepreneur. Their relationship ended abruptly when his accountant noticed unusual transactions from accounts Grace had access to. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Grace was a professional. This wasn't some young woman who'd fallen in love with my son and discovered his family had money. This was someone who targeted Mason specifically, studied him, planned her approach. I dug deeper into the files. Grace had a troubled past records of juvenile delinquency that had been sealed, a history of substance abuse treatment, and a strained relationship with her family who had apparently cut contact with her years ago. There were psychiatric evaluations suggesting narcissistic tendencies and manipulative behavior patterns. Most disturbing was the discovery that Grace had briefly worked for a company called Elder Transitions, a seemingly legitimate business that helped seniors manage their assets, but had been investigated for targeting wealthy elderly clients and manipulating them into transferring assets. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone. I needed to call Mason immediately, show him these files, make him understand what he'd married. But before I could dial, my doorbell rang. Mason stood in my hallway, and for a moment, my heart leaped with hope. Maybe he'd come to apologize, to bridge the gap between us. Then I saw Grace behind him, and that hope died. "Mom," Mason said, his voice carefully neutral. "We need to talk." I stepped aside to let them in, my mind racing. The files were still spread across my dining room table, but they'd have to pass through the living room first. I quickly closed the folders and slipped them under a magazine. "I'm glad you came," I said, though looking at Grace made my skin crawl. She was wearing a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, makeup minimal, the picture of wounded innocence. "Please, sit down." Grace perched on the edge of my sofa like she was afraid to get comfortable. Mason remained standing, his posture rigid. Grace has something she wants to say, he announced. I looked at her, waiting. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though I noticed no actual tears. "Mrs. Barrett," she began, her voice soft and trembling. "I owe you the deepest apology. What I did at the wedding, there's no excuse for it." I was emotional, overwhelmed, and I let my feelings about Mason's childhood cloud my judgment. It was a good performance. If I hadn't seen those files, if I didn't know what she really was, I might have believed her. "I see," I said carefully. "The truth is," Grace continued, glancing at Mason before looking back at me, "I was so protective of Mason because I know how much he struggled with feeling abandoned. When I thought you were just, well, when I didn't understand your situation, I reacted badly." "My situation," I repeated. Mason shifted uncomfortably. "She means when we thought you were struggling financially, before we knew about everything." "Everything," I repeated. "You mean my money, your wealth," Grace corrected gently. "Mason told me about your real estate empire. I had no idea." "Mrs. Barrett, what difference would it have made?" I asked, genuinely curious about how she'd spin this. "Well, I would have understood why you had to work so much when Mason was young. Building a business empire requires sacrifice. I see that now." She reached over and took Mason's hand. "We both do." I watched my son's face as she spoke. He was buying every word. The doubt I'd seen at the cafe was gone, replaced by relief. He wanted to believe this narrative, wanted to think his wife's attack had been motivated by protective love rather than cruel calculation. "That's very understanding of you," I said. "Both of you." Grace smiled, and for just a moment, I saw something cold flash in her eyes. "Family is so important, isn't it, now that we know the truth about your success? I hope we can start fresh. Maybe you could tell us more about your business. Mason and I would love to learn." There it was, the real reason for this visit. She wanted information about my assets, my investments, my estate planning. She was already calculating, already planning. "I'd be happy to share," I lied smoothly. "Perhaps you could tell me more about yourself first. Grace? Your family? Your background? I realize I know so little about the woman my son married." The smile faltered slightly. "Oh, there's not much to tell. I grew up in Ohio. Small-town girl. My parents passed away a few years ago. No siblings. Mason is really all the family I have now." Every word was carefully chosen to paint her as vulnerable, alone, deserving of protection and support. But I knew better now. Her parents were alive and well, living in a modest suburb of Cleveland. She had 2 brothers and a sister, all of whom had cut contact with her years ago for reasons Marcus was still investigating. "How tragic," I said. "Losing your parents so young." "It was difficult," she agreed, dabbing at those non-existent tears again. "But it taught me how precious family is, how important it is to hold on to the people you love." Mason squeezed her hand, and I saw the way he looked at her. Protective, adoring, completely blind to what was happening right in front of him. "Actually," Grace continued, "Mason and I have been talking about the future, about children, about providing for them. It's wonderful to know they'll have such a successful grandmother." My blood turned to ice. Children. She was already planning her next move, thinking about grandchildren who would tie her permanently to my family and my fortune. "Children are a blessing," I managed to say. "We're trying," Mason added, and the openness in his voice broke my heart. "We want to start a family right away." "How wonderful," I said. Though inside I was screaming. I needed them gone. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to save my son from this trap he'd willingly walked into. "Actually," I said, standing up, "I have a conference call with my lawyers in a few minutes about updating my estate planning. Perhaps we could continue this conversation another time." Grace's eyes sharpened at the mention of estate planning, though she tried to hide it. "Of course, we don't want to keep you from important business." As they gathered their things to leave, Grace paused at the door. "Mrs. Barrett, I just want you to know how much it means to Mason that we're reconciling. He's been so hurt by the distance between you two. I think knowing the truth about why you worked so hard will help him heal." "I hope so," I said. After they left, I retrieved Marcus's files and spread them out again. But this time I focused on the timeline. When had Grace first contacted Mason? According to the report, they'd met at a coffee shop near his office 18 months ago. She'd accidentally spilled her drink on him. But Mason worked for Barrett Holdings. Not the main office I'd kept our family connection quiet there, too, but a subsidiary that managed some of my smaller real estate investments. Anyone researching my business empire would eventually find that connection. She'd known. She'd known from the beginning. I picked up my phone and called Marcus again. "I need surveillance," I said when he answered. 24-hour coverage on my son and his wife. I want to know where they go, who they meet with, what they discuss, and Marcus. I want to know about any legal consultations they might seek. "Estate lawyers," he asked, "among others." I stared at the photographs of Grace with her previous marks. "I also need you to contact these men, the ones from her past. I want to know exactly what she did to them and why they didn't press charges. Because if Grace thought she could charm her way into my fortune by playing the role of devoted wife and future mother, she was about to learn that I hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by being naive." Marcus's surveillance reports arrived every morning like clockwork, and each one made my blood run colder. Grace wasn't wasting any time. 2 days after their visit to my apartment, she'd convinced Mason to make an appointment with Harrison & Associates, one of the city's most prestigious estate planning firms, the same firm that had been trying to poach my business for years. 3 days after that, she'd had lunch with someone Marcus identified as Dr. Patricia Winters, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in competency evaluations for wealthy elderly clients. By the end of the first week, I knew exactly what Grace was planning. She wasn't just after my money. She was preparing to have me declared mentally incompetent. Once Mason had power of attorney, she'd control him completely. And through him, everything I'd built. It was brilliant in its own sociopathic way. And it might have worked if I hadn't spent 30 years learning how to outmaneuver people who underestimated me. I was sitting in my study reviewing the latest surveillance photos when my housekeeper, Maria, knocked on the door. "Mrs. Barrett, your son is here. He says it's urgent." I quickly slipped the photos into a drawer and composed myself. "Send him in, please." Mason entered alone, which surprised me. For the past week, Grace had been attached to his side like a shadow. He looked tired, older somehow, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, taking the chair across from my desk. "About your health." Here it was, the opening move. "My health is fine, Mason," I said calmly. "Why do you ask?" "Grace has been worried about you. She thinks you might be struggling with some memory issues." I almost laughed. Of course, she did. "What kind of memory issues?" Mason shifted uncomfortably. "She mentioned that when you two talked last week, you seemed confused about some things, mixed up dates, forgot conversations you'd had. None of which had happened, but I could see how easily Grace could convince my son it had. He wanted to believe her about everything else." "Why not this, I see," I said. "And what does Grace think I should do about these supposed memory issues?" "She thinks you should see a doctor, get evaluated, maybe consider getting some help managing your affairs." "My affairs are perfectly well managed, Mason." "Are they?" He leaned forward, and I saw genuine concern in his eyes. "Mom, you're 73 years old, sitting on billions of dollars, and you live alone in a one-bedroom apartment. That's not normal." It was exactly the argument I'd expected. Paint my modest lifestyle as evidence of declining mental capacity rather than a deliberate choice to live quietly. "I live the way I choose to live," I said. "The same way I've lived for 20 years. "But that's just it," Mason said, his voice rising slightly. 20 years ago, I thought we were poor. Now I find out you've been wealthy this whole time. How do I know what else you've been hiding? How do I know you're making good decisions about anything?" I studied my son's face, seeing the genuine confusion and worry there. Grace was good. She'd planted seeds of doubt that were growing exactly as she'd planned. "What would make you feel better?" I asked. "Just see a doctor. Mom, get a clean bill of health. Then we can all stop worrying. All? Grace and me. We just want to make sure you're okay. I nodded slowly, as if considering it. I suppose that would be reasonable. Do you have someone in mind? Mason relaxed slightly. Actually, Grace found someone. Dr. Winters. She specializes in seniors. Has a great reputation. Of course, she had. The same Dr. Winters who'd had lunch with Grace the week before. The one who'd probably already been briefed on what diagnosis would be most helpful for my daughter-in-law's plans. I'd prefer to choose my own doctor, I said. Mason's jaw tightened. Mom, you can't just keep refusing help. This is about your safety, your well-being, and my money. The words hung in the air between us. Mason flushed red but didn't deny it. This isn't about money, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. This is about family, about making sure you're protected. Protected from whom? From myself. From people who might take advantage of you. He was standing now, pacing in front of my desk. Do you have any idea how vulnerable you are? How many people would love to get their hands on your fortune? Yes, I said quietly. I do. Something in my tone made him pause. He looked at me more carefully, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the intelligent boy he'd once been. What's that supposed to mean? It means I've been protecting myself and my assets for 30 years. Mason, it means I know exactly who poses a threat to my well-being. And it's not strangers. Then who? I met his eyes steadily. Ask yourself, who benefits most if I'm declared incompetent? Who gains control of my assets if something happens to me? Who suggested the doctor who's pushing for the evaluation? Who's been so concerned about my mental state since learning about my wealth? Mason went very still. You're talking about my wife. I'm talking about patterns. Mason, about people who target wealthy individuals for financial exploitation. That's insane, he said, but his voice had lost its edge. Grace loves me. She married me before she knew about the money. Did she? The question hit its mark. I saw doubt flicker in his eyes again, stronger this time. What are you saying? I'm saying you might want to ask yourself how a woman with no job and no family savings afforded the designer dress she wore to your wedding, how she's been able to maintain the lifestyle she's been living for the past 2 years. Where the money comes from? Mason was quiet for a long moment, processing. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. Even if that were true, and I'm not saying it is, but even if it were, she's my wife now. We're trying to have children. You can't just what? Protect yourself. Protect your future children from someone who sees them as meal tickets. You don't know her like I do. You're right. I know her better. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out one of Marcus's folders. Not the full report, Mason wasn't ready for that yet, but some of the more damning evidence. The photos of Grace with her previous marks. The documentation of her pattern. What is this? Mason asked, taking the folder with trembling hands. The truth about the woman you married. I watched his face as he flipped through the pages, watched the color drain from his cheeks, saw his hands start to shake. When he got to the photographs, he actually gasped. Where did you get these? I had her investigated the same way I investigate any potential threat to my family. You had my wife investigated. His voice was rising again, but now it was shock rather than anger. I had a stranger who attacked me at my son's wedding investigated, I corrected. A stranger who suddenly became very interested in reconciliation once she learned about my wealth. Mason sank back into his chair, still staring at the photos. These men, who are they? Her previous targets, all wealthy, all significantly older than their wives' usual demographic, all left poorer after their relationships with your wife ended. This can't be real. This has to be some kind of mistake. I pulled out my phone and played an audio file. Marcus had been thorough in his investigation, including interviews with Grace's previous victims. She was perfect at first, said the voice of David Harrison. Loving, attentive, made me feel like the most important man in the world. But looking back, I can see how calculated it all was. Every gesture, every word, every emotion was designed to make me trust her completely. Mason's face crumpled as he listened. When the recording ended, He looked at me with eyes full of pain. How long have you known? Since the day after you came here with her. I suspected something was wrong from the moment she attacked me, but I needed proof. And you didn't tell me? Would you have believed me, or would you have accused me of trying to destroy your marriage out of jealousy? He was quiet because we both knew the answer. What am I supposed to do now? He asked finally. That depends. Do you want to save your marriage or save yourself? I want to save both. That's not possible. Mason, not with someone like Grace. People like her don't change. They just get better at hiding what they are. He stood up abruptly, still clutching the folder. I need time to think. I need to process this. Time is something you may not have much of, I warned. She's already made appointments with lawyers and doctors. Whatever she's planning, it's moving forward quickly. I know. I thought I finally had a family. Someone who loved me. The pain in his voice broke my heart. You do have family. Mason, you have me. Do I? Because for 30 years, you've been lying to me about who you are. I've been protecting you. There's a difference. Is there? He moved toward the door, then paused. I don't know who to trust anymore. Mom, I don't know what's real. After he left, I sat in my study for a long time, staring at the evidence spread across my desk. I'd planted the seeds of doubt, but I needed to do more. Grace wouldn't give up easily, and Mason was still vulnerable to her manipulation. I picked up my phone and called Marcus. I need you to accelerate the investigation, I said. And I need you to arrange a meeting with someone from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. If Grace has been doing this to multiple victims, there might be grounds for federal charges. You want to have your son's wife arrested. I want to save my son before it's too late. Because sometimes protecting the people you love means making choices they'll never forgive you for. And sometimes being a mother means being willing to be the villain in your child's story, as long as they survive to have a story at all. 2 weeks passed without a word from Mason. 2 weeks of watching Marcus's surveillance reports, seeing my son grow more distant and hollow-eyed while Grace increased her pressure. She'd moved them into a luxury apartment downtown. Paid for with what money? I wondered. And had begun introducing Mason to financial advisors who specialized in managing family wealth. The trap was closing around him, and he either couldn't see it or didn't want to. That's when I decided to force the issue. I called Mason on a Thursday afternoon, my voice carefully modulated to sound slightly confused, a little frail. Mason, it's your mother. I was wondering, could you and Grace come for dinner on Saturday? I feel like we need to clear the air between us. There was a long pause. Mom, are you okay? You sound... I'm fine, dear. Just tired. This whole situation has been weighing on me. I think Grace was right. Maybe I do need to start making some changes. Planning for the future. I could practically hear his relief through the phone. Of course. We'll come. What time? 7 o'clock. And Mason, I'd like to discuss my estate planning with both of you. I think it's time I started trusting family to help me make important decisions. After I hung up, I called Marcus. Saturday night. I need full audio and video surveillance of my apartment. Hidden cameras. Directional microphones. Everything. What are you planning? I'm going to let Grace hang herself with her own rope. While I waited for Saturday to arrive, Marcus continued his deeper investigation into Grace's background. The results were even more disturbing than I'd anticipated. Grace Elizabeth Miller, her birth name before she legally changed it to Collins, had grown up in a middle-class family in Cleveland. Her childhood appeared normal on the surface, but school records showed behavioral issues beginning in her early teens. She'd been suspended multiple times for bullying, theft, and manipulation of teachers and peers. At 17, she was arrested for credit card fraud after stealing her parents' cards and running up thousands in debt. The charges were dropped after her parents agreed to pay, but according to interviews Marcus conducted with former neighbors, the family was never the same. She dropped out of 3 different colleges, each time after becoming romantically involved with wealthy professors or students. In each case, money disappeared, relationships were destroyed, and Grace moved on unscathed. Most disturbing was her brief employment at Elder Transitions, a company that had been under investigation for targeting wealthy seniors. The company provided legitimate services helping elderly clients manage their finances, but several employees had been charged with manipulating vulnerable clients into changing their wills or transferring assets. Grace had worked there for 8 months before abruptly leaving just as investigations intensified. No charges were filed against her specifically, but her supervisor had been convicted of elder financial abuse and was currently serving a 5-year sentence. This wasn't just an opportunist who had stumbled upon wealth. This was a calculated predator with a history of targeting the vulnerable and wealthy. And now she had set her sights on my son, and through him, me. Marcus had managed to contact 2 of Grace's previous victims. Both men were initially reluctant to speak, embarrassed by how thoroughly they'd been manipulated. But eventually, they opened up, painting a chilling picture of Grace's methodology. She studies you first, Michael Cortez had explained. Learns your weaknesses, your desires, what you're missing in your life. Then she becomes exactly that person. It's like she has this ability to transform herself into whatever you need most. David Harrison's account was even more disturbing. She isolated me from friends and family first, always with reasonable excuses. They were jealous of our relationship. They didn't understand our connection. They were using me for my money. The irony. Right, by the time I realized what was happening, I had no one left to turn to for help. Both men described how Grace had gradually taken control of their finances, always with plausible explanations. Both had lost significant amounts of money before discovering her deception, and both had chosen not to press charges partly from embarrassment, but mainly because Grace had collected compromising information on them that she threatened to release. She keeps receipts on everything, Harrison had said. Every mistake, every indiscretion, every potentially embarrassing moment. When I confronted her about the missing money, she had a file ready, pictures of me with other women before we met, recordings of business calls where I might have skirted some regulations. Nothing illegal, but enough to be humiliating if made public. I wondered what she had on Mason, what vulnerabilities she'd exploited, what secrets she'd collected to use against him if necessary. My son had always been sensitive, carrying the weight of perceived abandonment from his childhood. In Grace, he'd found someone who seemed to understand that pain, who validated it and promised to heal it. The perfect trap for a wounded heart. Saturday evening arrived gray and drizzling. I'd spent the day preparing, not just the dinner, but the performance I was about to give. I dressed in clothes that were slightly too big for me, did my makeup carelessly, left my hair a little disheveled. I needed to look like a woman whose mental faculties were declining. Marcus had arrived earlier, discreetly installing cameras and microphones throughout my apartment. The entire evening would be recorded, providing evidence of whatever Grace revealed when she thought I was vulnerable. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked before he left to monitor the equipment remotely. "These kinds of operations can be unpredictable, I'm sure. She thinks I'm a defenseless old woman who can be manipulated. Let's see what happens when I play into that belief." Mason and Grace arrived exactly on time. Mason looked nervous, constantly glancing between his wife and me as if expecting an explosion. Grace, on the other hand, looked triumphant. She was dressed elegantly but conservatively, playing the part of the concerned daughter-in-law. "Mrs. Barrett," she said, taking my hands in hers as she air-kissed my cheeks. "You look tired. Are you feeling all right?" "Oh, you know how it is at my age," I said, letting my voice quaver slightly. "Some days are better than others. Thank you both for coming. It means so much to have family around." Dinner was pot roast, Mason's favorite from childhood, though I deliberately oversalted it and let the vegetables get a bit mushy. Little details that would support the narrative of declining capabilities. "This is delicious, Mom," Mason said loyally, though I could see him struggling with the salty gravy. "Is it? I wasn't sure about the seasoning. I seem to have trouble with recipes lately. Yesterday, I put sugar in my coffee 3 times and couldn't remember doing it." Grace's eyes lit up with interest. "That must be frustrating. Have you considered getting some help? Maybe someone to assist with cooking and household management?" "I don't know," I said, pushing food around my plate uncertainly. "I've always been so independent, but lately I feel so confused about things. Finances, especially all those numbers and accounts. It's overwhelming. Mason and Grace exchanged a glance. The hook was baited. Maybe we could help, Grace suggested gently. Mason is so good with financial matters. Aren't you, honey? Mason nodded, though he looked uncomfortable. If you want, Mom, I could take a look at your portfolio, just to make sure everything's in order. Would you? That would be such a relief. I reached across the table and patted his hand. You know, I've been thinking about what you said before, about seeing a doctor, about getting my affairs in order. Really? Grace leaned forward, unable to hide her eagerness. I scheduled an appointment with that doctor you recommended, Dr. Winters, and I spoke with my lawyer about updating my will. That's wonderful news, Grace said, her voice warm with false concern. What kind of changes are you considering? Here was the moment I'd been building toward. I let my face crumple slightly as if I were about to cry. I'm so ashamed, I whispered. All these years I've been such a terrible mother to Mason, working all the time, missing everything important. I don't deserve to call myself his mother. Mom, don't say that, Mason protested, but I could see Grace's mind racing. No, it's true. And now at the end of my life, I want to make it right. I want to make sure you're taken care of. You and Grace and your future children. What are you saying? Mason asked. I took a shaky breath. I'm saying I want to transfer most of my assets to you now, while I'm still alive to see you enjoy them. Dr. Winters explained that it's common for people my age to start having trouble managing complex financial decisions. Better to hand things over while I can still make that choice myself. Grace couldn't contain herself any longer. That's very wise, Mrs. Barrett. So many elderly people wait too long, and then their families have to make difficult decisions for them. Exactly, I agreed. Much better this way. I was thinking of transferring about 60% of my liquid assets immediately. Maybe setting up a trust with Mason as the primary beneficiary and you as co-trustee. Mom, Mason looked stunned. That's hundreds of millions of dollars. Money I should have been sharing with you all along, I said, dabbing at my eyes with a napkin. I was so selfish, so focused on building my empire that I forgot what really mattered. Family. Grace was practically glowing. This is such a generous gesture and so practical. Mason, your mother is showing real wisdom here. I suppose, Mason said slowly. But Mom, are you sure that's a huge decision? I'm sure, I said firmly. In fact, I'd like to get the paperwork started as soon as possible. Maybe this week. Why the rush? Mason asked. I let my voice get small and frightened. In case she finds something wrong with me. If there are problems with my memory or judgment, I want to know that I made this decision while I was still myself. Grace reached over and squeezed my hand. That's very thoughtful. Mrs. Barrett, very responsible. There's just one thing, I added, as if it had just occurred to me. My lawyer insists on recording our conversation about the transfer. Legal protection, he says, to prove that I'm making this decision freely and with full understanding of what I'm doing. For just a moment, Grace's mask slipped. I saw calculation in her eyes, then caution. But greed won out. Of course, she said smoothly. Complete transparency is always best in these situations. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of planning. Grace suggested lawyers who could expedite the process. She mentioned financial advisors who could help manage the transition. She even brought up the possibility of Mason taking a more active role in my business operations. As they prepared to leave, Grace hugged me warmly. Mrs. Barrett, I want you to know how much this means to Mason, to both of us. You're giving us such a wonderful gift. It's the least I can do, I said. After all the years I lost with my son, Mason kissed my cheek goodbye, and I saw something in his eyes that broke my heart. Hope. He genuinely believed this was his mother trying to make amends, trying to rebuild their relationship through generosity. He had no idea he was about to witness his wife's complete destruction. After they left, I sat in my apartment for exactly 1 hour. Then I called Marcus. Did you get everything crystal clear, video and audio? She took the bait completely. Good. Now, I need you to contact FBI agent Sarah Chen. Tell her I have evidence of an ongoing scheme to defraud an elderly person. Tell her I have surveillance footage of the perpetrator discussing specific plans to manipulate a competency evaluation and gain control of assets through coercion. You're really going through with this. I thought about Mason's hopeful face, about the grandchildren Grace was planning to use as emotional leverage, about the decades of careful planning she was trying to unravel. She made one mistake, I said. She assumed that because I'm 73 and live modestly, I must be weak. She confused appearance with reality. And Mason? That was the question that had been haunting me. My son would hate me for this. He might never forgive me. Mason will understand eventually. And if he doesn't, well, at least he'll be alive and financially secure to hate me, because sometimes being a mother means saving your children from themselves, even when they can't see the danger, even when they'll never thank you for it. The next day, Marcus arranged a confidential meeting with FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen, who specialized in elder financial abuse cases. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. I liked her immediately. "Mrs. Barrett," she said after we were introduced, "Marcus has briefed me on the basics, but I'd like to hear it from you directly." For the next hour, I laid out the whole story: Grace's attack at the wedding, the subsequent discovery of her history, and her current plan to have me declared incompetent. I showed Agent Chen the files Marcus had compiled, including the interviews with Grace's previous victims. "This is certainly concerning," Agent Chen said, reviewing the evidence. "But proving intent to defraud can be challenging without clear evidence of the suspect actively engaging in the fraud." "I have that too," I said, and nodded to Marcus, who played the recording from the previous night's dinner. Agent Chen listened intently, her expression growing more serious as Grace's voice filled the room, discussing how to expedite the transfer of assets, suggesting specific doctors known for providing questionable competency evaluations, and strategizing about how to maintain control of the funds once they were transferred. When the recording ended, Agent Chen was silent for a moment. "Mrs. Barrett, did you intentionally present yourself as cognitively impaired to elicit these statements?" "I did." "You realize that could potentially complicate the case." "I understand legal procedure. Agent Chen, I didn't falsely claim to have been diagnosed with any condition. I simply exhibited behaviors that might suggest cognitive decline." "Ms. Collins chose to interpret those behaviors in a way that suited her purposes, and more importantly, she revealed her intent to exploit that perceived vulnerability." Agent Chen nodded thoughtfully. "There's certainly enough here to open a formal investigation. The pattern of behavior with previous victims strengthens the case considerably." "How long will the investigation take?" "Financial fraud cases can be complex. We'll need to trace financial records, interview previous victims who are willing to come forward, and build a solid case that can withstand scrutiny in court. It could be weeks or even months." "I don't have months." "Agent Chen, Grace is accelerating her timeline. She's already scheduled me for a competency evaluation with a doctor who's known for providing favorable opinions to those who pay enough. She's meeting with estate lawyers who specialize in circumventing standard protections." Agent Chen considered this. "There might be a faster approach. If we can catch her in the act of attempting to fraudulently transfer funds or falsify medical records, we could move much more quickly." "What would that entail?" "A sting operation. We'd need your full cooperation, and it would involve some risk." "I built a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire from nothing. Agent Chen, I'm not afraid of risk." Over the next several days, Agent Chen and her team worked with Marcus and me to develop a plan. We would proceed with the competency evaluation with Dr. Winters, but with FBI agents monitoring the session, we would begin the paperwork for the asset transfer, but with specific triggers built in that would alert authorities to any manipulation. The goal was to catch both Grace and anyone collaborating with her like Dr. Winters in the act of committing fraud. It was a dangerous game, putting myself in the position of appearing vulnerable to people who wanted to exploit that vulnerability. But it was the fastest way to gather the evidence needed for prosecution. Meanwhile, Mason remained distant. He called occasionally, always with Grace nearby, judging by the guarded nature of his conversations. He seemed torn between excitement about the pending transfer of assets and concern about my well-being. I longed to tell him the truth, to warn him about the trap we were setting. But Agent Chen had been adamant. The fewer people who know about the operation, the better. Even those with the best intentions can inadvertently compromise an investigation. I understood the logic, but it didn't make it any easier to hear the hope in my son's voice, knowing that hope would soon be shattered. The day of my appointment with Dr. Winters arrived. Agent Chen's team had wired me with a hidden microphone and had agents stationed nearby. The plan was simple. I would play the role of a confused elderly woman, allowing Dr. Winters to guide the evaluation in whatever direction Grace had arranged. Dr. Patricia Winters' office was designed to project warmth and competence, soft lighting, tasteful art, comfortable furniture that was still easy for older patients to navigate. The doctor herself was in her 50s, impeccably dressed, with a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Mrs. Barrett, it's a pleasure to meet you," she said, gesturing for me to sit in a plush chair across from her desk. "Your son and daughter-in-law have spoken so highly of you." "Have they?" I said, deliberately sounding uncertain. "That's nice. She's very helpful lately. I understand you've been experiencing some difficulties with memory and decision-making. That must be frightening." "Sometimes I get confused," I admitted, playing into the narrative Grace had created. "Dates, names. Sometimes I can't remember if I've taken my medication." Dr. Winters nodded sympathetically, making notes. "That's not uncommon at your age. I'd like to perform a standard cognitive assessment today, just to get a baseline of where you are." The evaluation proceeded with a series of questions and tasks designed to test memory, reasoning, and judgment. I deliberately performed poorly on some tests while doing well on others, a pattern that would be difficult to classify neatly as dementia or another cognitive disorder, but would give Dr. Winters enough ammunition if she was looking to support a finding of diminished capacity. Throughout the evaluation, Dr. Winters made leading comments that concerned me. "You seem to struggle with financial calculations. Do you find managing your investments difficult?" "Oh yes," I said. "All those numbers, all those decisions. Mason and Grace want to help me with that." "That's very wise," Dr. Winters said, writing something in her notes. "Many patients find relief in transferring those burdens to trusted family members." By the end of the session, I had given Dr. Winters ample opportunity to make a legitimate assessment and equally ample opportunity to skew her findings if that was her intent. "Well, Mrs. Barrett, I'll need to analyze these results more thoroughly, but I do have some preliminary concerns about your cognitive function, particularly in areas related to financial decision-making and memory." Is it dementia?" I asked, allowing my voice to tremble. "I wouldn't jump to that conclusion yet," she said, her voice professionally reassuring. "But I do think it would be prudent to consider appointing someone to help you manage your affairs while you're still able to make that choice yourself. Mason has been talking about that too, about me signing over some control to him and Grace." Dr. Winters nodded. "That's very sensible. I'd be happy to provide documentation supporting that decision, noting that you're currently competent to make the choice, but showing signs that suggest intervention would be beneficial before your condition progresses." And there it was, exactly what Grace had arranged. A medical opinion that I was just competent enough to legally transfer assets, but declining enough to justify doing so immediately. It was elegantly corrupt. "When could you have that documentation ready?" I asked. "I could have a preliminary report by tomorrow. I understand from your daughter-in-law that there's some urgency to getting your affairs in order." "Yes," I said. "Grace is very concerned about me." After leaving Dr. Winters' office, I met with Agent Chen in a secure location to review the recording. "She's definitely cooperating with your daughter-in-law," Agent Chen confirmed after listening to the audio. "The evaluation was perfunctory at best, and her conclusions were clearly predetermined. We'll need to investigate their connection more thoroughly, but this is a promising start." "What's next?" "We continue with the plan, proceed with the transfer documentation, but stall the actual signing until we've gathered more evidence. We need to document the full scope of the conspiracy." Over the next few days, Grace's eagerness became increasingly difficult to hide. She called daily, checking on the status of Dr. Winters' report and suggesting specific language for the transfer documents. She arranged meetings with financial advisors who, according to Marcus's research, had questionable histories of their own. Mason seemed swept along in her enthusiasm, though I detected notes of concern in his voice during our conversations. He was genuinely worried about my health, even as he stood to benefit from the supposed decline. The conflict was tearing him apart, and I ached to end his suffering, to tell him the truth. But the investigation had to proceed. A week after my visit to Dr. Winters, the pieces were in place. Grace had arranged for the transfer documents to be signed at our home. With a notary, she had selected another red flag that Agent Chen's team was investigating. Dr. Winters had provided her report, which diagnosed me with mild cognitive impairment with signs of progressing dementia. Despite having conducted only the most cursory examination, the night before the scheduled signing, Agent Chen called with an update. "We found the connection. Dr. Winters has worked with Grace before, providing similar evaluations for at least 2 other elderly victims. And the notary she's arranged for tomorrow, James Peterson, has been involved in multiple questionable asset transfers. We're ready to move when you are." "Tomorrow, then," I said. When they arrived for the signing, that night, I barely slept, thinking about Mason, about the look on his face when he realized the truth. Would he ever forgive me for the deception? Would he understand that everything I'd done from hiding my wealth to setting this trap had been to protect him? Morning came too quickly, and with it, the final act of a drama that had been building for months. Agent Chen's team was in position. Surveillance equipment was active, and I was as ready as I would ever be to face the woman who had tried to destroy my family. At precisely 10:00 a.m., the doorbell rang. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and opened the door to find Mason, Grace, Dr. Winters, and a man I assumed was the notary, James Peterson. Grace's smile was triumphant as she kissed my cheek and guided me back into my own living room. "Mrs. Barrett, you remember Dr. Winters? And this is Mr. Peterson, the notary I mentioned. He'll be witnessing the documents today." "Of course," I said, affecting slight confusion. "The doctor and the lawyer notary," Grace corrected gently. "He's here to make everything legal and proper." "Are you feeling all right today, Mom?" Mason asked, concern evident in his voice. "Just a little tired," I said. "Not sleeping well lately." Dr. Winters nodded sympathetically. "That's common with your condition, Mrs. Barrett. Disrupted sleep patterns often accompany cognitive changes." I noticed Mason flinch slightly at her casual diagnosis. Perhaps he wasn't as completely under Grace's spell as I'd feared. "Let's get started, shall we?" Grace said, guiding me to the dining table where the documents were already laid out. "Everything is prepared exactly as we discussed. The transfer of 60% of your liquid assets to the joint trust, with Mason as primary beneficiary and myself as co-trustee." "It all looks very official," I said, staring at the stack of papers. "Mr. Peterson will walk you through everything," Grace assured me. "We just need your signature in a few places." The notary began explaining the documents, but his explanation was cursory at best, glossing over key details about control and access to the funds. As he pushed the first document toward me, pen in hand, I hesitated. "I'm not sure I understand all of this," I said. "Maybe I should have my lawyer review it first." Grace's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "We discussed this. Remember, your lawyer already reviewed the initial draft. This is exactly what you wanted to start transferring assets now, while you still can." "While I still can," I repeated, as if trying to remember. "Because of my condition." "Yes," Dr. Winters interjected smoothly. "My evaluation indicated that while you're currently competent to make these decisions, there are concerning signs of cognitive decline that would make it advisable to complete these arrangements promptly." I looked at Mason, who was watching me with a pained expression. "Do you think this is the right thing to do?" "Son," before he could answer, Grace placed a hand on his arm. "We've talked about this, honey. Your mother needs our help managing her affairs before things get worse." Mason nodded, but I could see doubt in his eyes. "If it's what you want, Mom, we support your decision." "It is what I want," I said, picking up the pen. "To make sure everything is taken care of properly." I paused with the pen hovering over the signature line, looking up at Grace's expectant face. Just one thing before I sign, I said. I'd like to understand exactly how this trust will be managed. Who will have access to the funds? Grace's smile never wavered. Mason, of course, as the primary beneficiary, and I'll help as co-trustee, just managing day-to-day decisions when needed. So you would have direct access to the accounts, only for your benefit, Mrs. Barrett, to help with bills, medical expenses, whatever you need. I nodded slowly, then set the pen down. And when exactly did you change your name from Grace Miller to Grace Collins? The smile froze on her face. Or perhaps I should ask about David Harrison, Michael Cortez, Jonathan Parker. They all remember you quite well, though under different names. Mason turned to Grace, confusion written across his face. What is she talking about? Before Grace could respond, I stood up. I think it's time we ended this charade, don't you? The doorbell rang, right on cue. Marcus opened it to admit Agent Chen and 2 other FBI agents. What's going on? Grace demanded, her voice rising. Mason, your mother is clearly confused. This is exactly why we need to get these documents signed. Mrs. Grace Collins Barrett, Agent Chen interrupted, showing her badge. I'm Special Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI. We have some questions about your involvement in a series of financial fraud cases across multiple states. Grace's face drained of color. This is ridiculous. I don't know what you're talking about. Perhaps Dr. Winters or Mr. Peterson might be able to clarify, Agent Chen suggested, turning to the now panicking doctor and notary. We have evidence linking both of you to a pattern of fraudulent competency evaluations and improper asset transfers. Mom, Mason looked at me, bewilderment and betrayal in his eyes. What have you done protected you? I said simply, the same way I've been protecting you your entire life. As the FBI agent separated Grace, Dr. Winters, and the notary for questioning, I took Mason's arm and led him to the kitchen, away from the chaos in the living room. I'm not cognitively impaired. Mason, I never have been. This was a sting operation to catch your wife and her accomplices in the act of attempting to defraud me. Mason sank into a chair, his face ashen. How long have you been planning this? Since I confirmed what I suspected about Grace. She's done this before. Mason, multiple times. She targets wealthy individuals, isolates them from support networks, then manipulates them into transferring assets, sometimes directly, sometimes, as in your case, through family members she can control. Control? He looked up sharply. She doesn't control me, doesn't she? How many of your old friends do you still see regularly? How many decisions do you make without consulting her first? How often do you find yourself agreeing to things you're not entirely comfortable with because she's convinced you it's for the best? Mason was silent, and I could see the truth of my words sinking in. The FBI has been building this case for weeks, I continued gently. They have evidence linking Grace to at least 3 other victims. They have recordings of her conspiring with Dr. Winters to falsify medical evaluations. And they have financial records showing a pattern of fraud dating back nearly a decade. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why go through all this deception? Would you have believed me? Or would Grace have convinced you I was a jealous, controlling mother trying to undermine your marriage? Mason didn't answer, which was answer enough. Besides, I added, the FBI needed clean evidence, untainted by foreknowledge. If you had known about the investigation, your behavior might have alerted Grace. From the living room, we heard raised voices. Grace was protesting her innocence as Agent Chen read her rights. She said she's pregnant, Mason said suddenly, looking up at me with devastated eyes. She told me last week we're having a baby. My heart sank. This was the one complication I hadn't anticipated. Mason, but before I could respond, Agent Chen appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Barrett, we'll need formal statements from both you and your son. And Mr. Barrett, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. We've confirmed through medical records that your wife is not pregnant. The test she showed you was purchased online, a common tactic in these cases to strengthen emotional bonds and complicate potential legal proceedings. Mason's face crumpled, and in that moment, he looked like the little boy I remembered, the one who'd cry when I had to leave for work, the one who'd hold on to my hand so tightly when I tucked him in at night. Everything, he whispered. Everything was a lie. I wrapped my arms around my son for the first time in years, and he didn't pull away. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of FBI interviews, lawyer consultations, and emotional exhaustion. Mason stayed at my apartment, unable to face returning to the luxury condo he'd shared with Grace. He spent most of that time in shocked silence, emerging occasionally to ask a question that revealed just how thoroughly he'd been deceived. "She told me her parents died in a car accident 5 years ago," he said as we sat together in my living room that evening. "That she had no family left. Her parents are alive and well in Cleveland," I replied gently. "They cut contact with her after she stole from them repeatedly. And her job, she said she was a freelance marketing consultant. She had no consistent employment for the past 5 years. Her income came from men like you men she targeted and manipulated." Mason shook his head, still struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he'd married with the reality of who Grace truly was. "I thought she understood me. She knew exactly how I felt about growing up without you around much. She would talk about it in ways that made me feel like someone finally got it. That's how predators like Grace operate," I explained. "They study their targets, identify vulnerabilities, then position themselves as the perfect solution to whatever pain you're carrying." "So even that was calculated." Mason's voice cracked. "The way she'd comfort me when I talked about feeling abandoned as a kid, the way she'd defend me whenever the subject of my childhood came up. Including her public attack on me at your wedding," I said. "That wasn't spontaneous rage on your behalf. It was a calculated move to isolate you further from me, to cement her position as your protector against the mother who failed you." Mason was quiet for a long moment. "I've been such a fool." "No," I said firmly. "You were targeted by someone who has made a career out of manipulating people. Intelligence, education, success, none of these make you immune to emotional manipulation. Some of the smartest, most accomplished people in the world have fallen for similar schemes. But I brought her into our family. I let her get close to you, close to your money. You fell in love with a carefully crafted illusion." I interrupted. "That's not your fault." "Agent Chen said Grace might plead guilty to avoid a full trial," Mason said, changing the subject. "She thinks Grace will try to cut a deal, provide evidence against Dr. Winters and others involved in similar schemes. That would be the smart play," I agreed. "She's facing serious federal charges: fraud, conspiracy, wire fraud for the electronic transfers she attempted, not to mention the state charges for identity theft and practicing medicine without a license. Medicine without a license. She apparently gave medical advice to Dr. Winters' other victims, posing as a nurse practitioner to help convince them they needed certain medications that coincidentally made them more compliant and confused." Mason shuddered. "Did she have others while she was with me?" I hesitated. Marcus had uncovered evidence suggesting Grace had been grooming at least one other wealthy target during her relationship with Mason, a backup plan in case her primary scheme failed. "I don't know for certain," I said, unwilling to add to his pain without definitive proof. Mason seemed to read the truth in my face anyway. He laughed bitterly. "Of course she did. Why limit yourself to just one mark, right? Mason, it's fine. I need some time." He stood up and walked to the guest bedroom, closing the door firmly behind him. I sat alone in the living room, victory feeling hollow in the face of my son's pain. I'd saved him from Grace's predation, but the cost had been steep. His heart, his trust, his faith in his own judgment. Some rescues leave more scars than the danger they averted. Morning brought a call from Agent Chen with updates on the case. "Grace is talking," she informed me. "She's offered to testify against Drs. Winters and James Peterson, as well as several other co-conspirators we weren't even aware of. She's trying to minimize her own role, of course, portraying herself as a reluctant participant rather than the mastermind." "Will that work?" I asked. "Not likely. We have too much evidence of her orchestrating these schemes, going back years before she met any of her known accomplices. But her cooperation will help build stronger cases against the others." "What about Mason? Will he need to testify?" "Possibly, though we'll try to minimize his involvement. The evidence we gathered during the sting operation is quite comprehensive. Your surveillance and cooperation have given us a very solid case." After I hung up, I found Mason in the kitchen, making coffee. He looked like he hadn't slept. The FBI says Grace is cooperating, I told him, trying to reduce her sentence by testifying against others. Mason nodded numbly. What happens now with the annulment? I mean, your lawyer thinks it should be straightforward. Marriage under false pretenses. Clear evidence of fraud predating the marriage. The fact that Grace will likely be convicted of related crimes makes it even simpler. And the press. This will be news. Won't it? Billionaire's son duped by con artist wife? I sighed. I've asked Marcus to work with a crisis management team. They can't stop the story, but they can help shape the narrative. Focus on Grace's pattern of victimizing others, the broader criminal conspiracy. Position you as one victim among many. Except I'm the only victim stupid enough to marry her, Mason said bitterly. Mason, stop. Self-recrimination won't help you heal from this. He slammed his coffee mug down, splashing hot liquid across the counter. Don't you get it? Mom, this isn't just about Grace. It's about you, too. You've been lying to me my entire life. You built a financial empire while letting me believe we were barely getting by. You missed my childhood because you were working. But it turns out you could have hired an army of nannies and assistants. You could have been there. The accusation hit home because it contained truth. I had made choices I believed were for his protection and benefit, but choices that had hurt him nonetheless. You're right, I said quietly. I kept the truth from you. I thought I was protecting you from the dangers of growing up with extreme wealth, the entitlement, the fair-weather friends, the constant question of whether people liked you for yourself or your money. So instead, I grew up feeling abandoned and unwanted, Mason said. Great trade-off. I was wrong, I admitted. Not about the dangers of wealth, those are real, but I was wrong to think that hiding the truth from you was the answer. I should have found a way to include you in that part of my life while still teaching you the values I thought were important. Mason seemed surprised by my admission. You're actually saying you made a mistake. I've made many mistakes. Mason, the biggest was allowing my fear to keep me from being honest with you. I was so afraid of the dangers wealth might bring to your life that I created a different kind of damage instead. He was quiet for a moment, absorbing my words. I need to ask you something, and I need the truth, the complete truth. Anything. Why were you really working so much? Was it all for the money, for the empire building, or was there more? This was the moment I'd been avoiding for decades, the full truth that I'd never shared, even when revealing my wealth. After your father died, I began carefully. Things were more complicated than I've let on. James left us with nothing but debt. That part was true. But he also left us with enemies. Mason frowned. What do you mean, enemies? Your father wasn't just unsuccessful in business. He was involved with some dangerous people, loan sharks, private lenders with connections to organized crime. He borrowed heavily, using false collateral. Dad was involved with criminals. Mason looked shocked. He was desperate and reckless. When he died, those debts didn't disappear. They came looking for payment from me, from his estate, from anything they could get. But we had nothing, Mason said. You always said the insurance barely covered the funeral. That's true. But these weren't people who accepted I have nothing as an answer. They made threats. Against me. Against you. Mason paled. Against me, I was just a kid. Exactly. You were 6 years old, and men were showing up at our apartment suggesting they might take their payment in other ways if I couldn't come up with cash. The memory still made my blood run cold. That's when I started working multiple jobs, not just to support us, but to pay off your father's debts as quickly as possible. You never told me any of this. What was I supposed to say? Daddy made bad decisions and now dangerous men might hurt us. You were a child who just lost his father. I wanted to protect you from that fear. And the real estate business, how did that fit in? Meeting Eleanor was genuine luck. She saw potential in me, mentored me, gave me my start. But my drive, my relentless work ethic that came from knowing I needed not just financial stability, but real security, the kind that would ensure no one could threaten us again. So all those nights you were working, Mason began. I was building a fortress around us, brick by brick. First paying off the immediate threats, then creating enough financial cushion that we could disappear if needed. And finally building real power, the kind that makes even dangerous people think twice before coming after you. Mason was quiet, processing this new information. Why keep it secret even after the danger had passed, even after you'd become successful? By then, the habit of secrecy was ingrained, and I'd seen what sudden wealth did to people. I wanted you to develop your own strength, your own identity, before facing that challenge. I sighed. As I said, I made mistakes. I protected you from some dangers while exposing you to others. Like Grace, Mason said quietly. Like Grace, I agreed. If you'd known about the family wealth, you might have been more suspicious of someone like her, or you might have become the entitled, spoiled rich kid I feared. There's no way to know which path would have been better. Mason rubbed his eyes, looking exhausted. It's a lot to take in. All of it. I know, and I don't expect forgiveness or understanding right away, but I promise you this: no more secrets. Whatever you want to know about the business, about our family, about anything, I'll tell you the complete truth. I want to see it, he said suddenly. Your business, your real life, the empire you built while I wasn't looking. I nodded. Whenever you're ready. Tomorrow, Mason decided. I need to see what was so important that it took my mother away from me for all those years. The next morning, I took Mason to the real heart of Barrett Holdings, not the modest satellite office where he'd been working, but the main headquarters in the financial district. The executive elevator required a special key card, whisking us directly to the top floor where my actual office was located. Mason's eyes widened as we stepped into the expansive corner office with its panoramic views of the city. The space was elegant but not ostentatious fine art on the walls, custom furniture, but nothing flashy or excessive. You've been working here all this time, he asked, taking in the view. For the past 15 years, I confirmed. Before that, we were in a smaller building downtown. My executive assistant, Angela, who had been with me for over a decade, greeted us warmly. Mr. Barrett, it's wonderful to finally meet you in person. Your mother speaks of you often. Mason looked startled, then turned to me. She knows who I am. A handful of key people know about our relationship. I explained. People I trust completely, who understand the need for discretion. I gave Mason a tour of the executive floor, introducing him to the senior leadership team, many of whom had known about him for years but had respected my privacy. They greeted him with a warmth and familiarity that clearly surprised him. Ms. Jackson says you showed her pictures from my college graduation, Mason said as we left the CFO's office. I've always been proud of you, I said simply. Even if I couldn't always show it publicly. In the boardroom, I showed him the scale of Barrett Holdings, the organizational charts, the global reach, the diverse portfolio of properties and investments. This is incredible, Mason said, examining a display showing our current projects. You built all this, with a lot of help from talented people, I acknowledged. But yes, this grew from that small company Eleanor sold me all those years ago. And this is what you were doing while I thought you were working night shifts, cleaning offices. The question held less accusation than earlier, but the hurt was still there. In the beginning, I really was cleaning offices, I reminded him. That part wasn't a lie. But as the business grew, yes, many of those late nights were spent here, making deals, solving problems, building this company. Why keep me separate from all of it? Why not bring me in? Show me what you were creating. I wanted you to find your own path, I explained. To develop skills and confidence that weren't dependent on being the boss's son. And truthfully, I was afraid. Afraid of what? That you would reject this world. Or worse, that you would embrace it too fully. Become defined by wealth rather than character. I've seen what happens to children who grow up with extreme privilege. The entitlement, the emptiness, the lack of purpose. Mason was quiet for a moment. So instead, you let me grow up feeling like I wasn't important enough for you to make time for. The words stung, but they weren't untrue. I made the wrong choice, Mason. I can see that now. In trying to protect you from one set of problems, I created another. Did you ever plan to tell me the truth? Yes, I say, Annie. The trust fund I established for you becomes accessible on your 40th birthday. I had planned to explain everything then, to bring you fully into this world once you'd established your own identity and career. 5 more years, Mason said thoughtfully. 5 more years of living a lie. A mistake I deeply regret, I admitted. Especially now, seeing how my secrecy made you vulnerable to someone like Grace. After the tour, we had lunch in my private dining room, where Mason continued to process everything he'd learned. I still don't understand why you live in that small apartment, he said. You could have any home you wanted. That apartment has been my refuge, I explained. A place where I could just be Fiona, not the CEO, not the billionaire, not the target of people wanting something from me. It's the one place where I could be sure people were seeing me, not my money. But you let me believe we couldn't afford better. You let me feel ashamed when friends came over. And that was wrong, I acknowledged. I should have found a better balance, a comfortable home that didn't broadcast wealth, but didn't make you feel inadequate either. Mason picked at his food, still struggling with the revelations. All those times I resented you for working instead of coming to my games or school events. I missed too much, I said. Whether building an empire or cleaning offices, I wasn't there enough. That's my greatest regret. Did you even want to be a mother? The question came suddenly, brutally honest. With all my heart. I answered without hesitation. From the moment I knew I was pregnant with you, you were the center of my world. Mason. Everything I did, every sacrifice, every long night, every difficult decision was for you. I just made mistakes in how I showed that love. For the first time since this ordeal began, I saw something soften in my son's eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. I'd like to learn, he said finally, about the business, about what you've built. I want to understand this part of your life that's been hidden from me. I'd like that too, I said, hope flickering to life inside me. Whatever you want to know, however involved you want to be, it's your choice. No pressure, no expectations. I can't promise anything, Mason warned. I'm still processing. Everything. Grace, you, this company. It's a lot. Take all the time you need, I assured him. I've waited 30 years to share this with you. I can be patient a little longer. The legal proceedings against Grace moved more quickly than expected. Faced with overwhelming evidence, she agreed to a plea deal, admitting to multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her cooperation led to charges against Drs. Winters, James Peterson, and several others involved in similar schemes targeting wealthy elderly individuals. Mason was largely spared from public involvement, though he did provide a written victim impact statement for the court. The press covered the story, but Marcus's crisis management team did an excellent job of positioning Mason as just one of many victims of a sophisticated criminal enterprise. 6 months after Grace's arrest, I sat in the courtroom as the judge delivered her sentence, 8 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release and restitution payments to her victims. Grace looked nothing like the confident, polished woman who had shoved my face into mashed potatoes. Her designer clothes had been replaced by a plain suit, her carefully styled hair pulled back severely, her makeup minimal. She kept her eyes down, avoiding contact with anyone in the courtroom, until the very end, when she was being led away. Just for a moment, she looked directly at me, and I saw not remorse but cold calculation in her eyes. Even now, even in defeat, she was already planning her next move, her next reinvention. People like Grace didn't change. They just adapted their predatory tactics to new circumstances. Mason hadn't attended the sentencing. I don't need to see her again, he'd said when I asked if he wanted to come. I'm trying to move forward. Moving forward had been a complex process for both of us. Mason had filed for an annulment rather than a divorce, legally erasing the marriage that had never been based on truth. He'd moved out of the luxury apartment he'd shared with Grace and into a modest but comfortable condo in a different part of the city. And, most significantly, he'd begun working with me at Barrett Holdings not in his previous role at the subsidiary, but at the main company, learning the business from the ground up. It was his choice, a way of understanding the world I'd hidden from him for so long. "I want to see what was worth missing my childhood for," he'd said when he first proposed the idea. The words still barbed with pain. But over time, as he immersed himself in the business, I saw his perspective shifting. We were in my office reviewing quarterly reports 6 months after Grace's sentencing. Mason had thrown himself into learning the business with the same intensity he'd once applied to winning Grace's approval, but now that energy was building something real, something lasting. "The Portland development is ahead of schedule," he reported, flipping through his notes. "And the Sustainable Housing Initiative is attracting investors faster than we projected." "Good," I nodded. "What about the scholarship program?" "Fully funded for the next decade. We've already awarded grants to over 200 students." The scholarship program had been Mason's idea, a way to help promising young people from disadvantaged backgrounds attend college without crippling debt. It was the first initiative he'd championed at the company, and watching him pour his heart into it had been a joy. I watched him work, this son I'd thought I'd lost, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete peace. The empire I'd built had always been about providing for Mason's future. Now it was about building that future together. "Mason," I said, "I want you to know something. Everything I did, every choice I made, even the mistakes, it was all worth it to get to this moment." He looked up from his reports and smiled a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I know, Mom. And for the first time in my life, I really understand what that means." The road to healing hadn't been smooth or straight. There had been setbacks, arguments, moments when old wounds reopened and bled afresh. Mason had struggled with trust issues after Grace's betrayal, becoming overly suspicious of anyone who showed interest in him professionally or personally. I'd suggested therapy, and to my surprise, he'd agreed on the condition that I attend some sessions with him to work through our complicated history together. Those joint sessions had been painful but cathartic, forcing us both to confront decades of misunderstandings and missed connections. "I resented you for so long," Mason had admitted during one particularly difficult session, "for not being there, for choosing work over me. I used to imagine you just didn't care enough to make time for me. And I thought I was showing my love by providing security, by building something that would protect you long after I was gone." I'd responded. We were speaking different languages of love. Slowly, gradually, we'd begun to understand each other's perspectives, to build a new relationship based on honesty rather than the carefully constructed half-truths that had defined our past. Now, sitting in my office, I could see the fruits of that painful growth. Mason wasn't just learning the business. He was bringing new ideas, fresh perspectives, a vision for how Barrett Holdings could be more than just profitable, but also purposeful. "I've been thinking," Mason said, closing his folder of reports, "about the future of the company. Oh, we have all this wealth, all this influence. We should be using it more deliberately to address systemic problems: affordable housing, educational access, economic mobility. The scholarship program is a start, but we could do so much more." I smiled, recognizing in his words the idealism I'd once had, the belief that success brought not just privilege, but responsibility. "I think that's an excellent direction," I agreed. "What specifically did you have in mind?" As Mason outlined his vision for expanding our philanthropic initiatives while maintaining profitable core operations, I felt a surge of pride. This was what I'd always wanted for him, not just financial security, but purpose, direction, the opportunity to make a meaningful impact. "You know," I said when he finished, "you're going to be a much better leader than I ever was." Mason looked surprised. "What makes you say that?" "Because you're starting with the understanding I had to learn the hard way, that true success isn't measured in dollars, but in impact. It took me decades to recognize that. You're beginning with that wisdom." "I had a good teacher," he said quietly, "even when I didn't know I was being taught." We worked late that evening, side by side, mapping out the future of Barrett Holdings. As we were preparing to leave, Mason paused at the door. "Mom, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." "What is it?" That day at the wedding, when everything happened, you could have revealed your wealth then, put her in her place. Why did you just walk away? I considered the question carefully, because at that moment, it wasn't about wealth or status or putting anyone in their place. It was about dignity. Sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is simply refusing to let it diminish you. Mason nodded thoughtfully. I'm beginning to understand why you've been so successful. It's not just business acumen. It's knowing when to fight and when to simply rise above. A lesson I'm still learning, I admitted. As we walked to the elevator together, Mason surprised me by asking about something we hadn't discussed in months. Do you ever think about Grace wonder what she's doing in prison? Sometimes, I acknowledged. Not out of concern for her, but to remind myself to stay vigilant. People like Grace don't stop being predators. They just change their hunting grounds. I still can't believe I didn't see through her. Grace was exceptionally skilled at what she did. She'd had years of practice creating exactly the persona her targets needed to see. Still, Mason sighed. I should have known something wasn't right. The way she isolated me from friends, her convenient lack of family, her intense interest in my childhood wounds, it all seems so obvious in hindsight. Hindsight always is, I said gently. The important thing is what you do with that clarity moving forward. As we stepped into the elevator, Mason turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Thank you, he said simply. For what? For not giving up on me. For fighting for me. Even when I was too blind to see I needed saving. I reached for his hand, and for the first time in years, he didn't pull away. That's what mothers do, I said. We protect our children, even when they think they don't need protection, even when they hate us for it. I never hated you, Mason said quietly. I was hurt, confused, angry, but I never hated you. The elevator doors opened to the lobby, but before we stepped out, I pulled my son into an embrace. I love you, Mason. I've made many mistakes, but loving you was never one of them. He hugged me back, tight and genuine. I love you too, Mom. As we walked out of the building together, I reflected on the long, painful journey that had brought us to this moment. Grace's betrayal, as devastating as it had been, had ultimately given Mason and me the opportunity to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of truth rather than protective lies. Sometimes the greatest storms in our lives clear away what's broken to make room for something stronger. Sometimes what feels like an ending is really the painful but necessary beginning of something better. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the villain in your story becomes the catalyst that helps you find your way back to what matters most. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below and share your experiences.